This talk is by Mark Simkin from Aarhus, who will talk about black box transformation from passive to covert security with public verifiability.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. So this is a joint work with Ivan and Claudio. And yes, so as most of the talks, this is about secure computation. So imagine that you have some parties and they have some private inputs and they would like to compute a function of their private inputs. So here we have these three parties, they have their private music preferences and they would like to decide which song will they listen to next. So an obvious solution for this problem is to use MPC. So generally in MPC, we consider two types of adversaries. So the first type of adversary is the passive adversary, where the adversary follows the protocol, but he would like to learn more than what is revealed by the outputs. For example, he would like to learn what are Bob's music preferences. So then we also consider active adversaries, which actually want to maybe change the output of the computation. So they behave in an arbitrary way and they do whatever they like. They can even abort the protocol. And for example, here, the adversary would like us maybe to all listen to chalkboard scrapings. Okay, so these are kind of the two most popular adversarial models that we usually consider in the MPC literature. And both of them have some drawbacks. So for the passive adversaries, the threat model is somewhat weak. So a passive adversary may not be sufficient for certain real world applications where we do actually want to protect ourselves from an actively malicious party. On the other hand, active adversary, like security against active adversaries, is a very strong security notion. So achieving the security notion doesn't come for free. So if we compare kind of passively secure protocols and their actively secure counterparts, then there is a certain gap in efficiency. So you have to pay a price for having active security. So this was already observed by Aumann and Lindell in 2007. And there they introduced an adversarial model, which is in between passive and active security, which they called covert adversaries. So here the idea is to still consider an active adversary who may misbehave in an arbitrary fashion. But now we only require that the honest parties detect this malicious behavior with a constant probability. So with active security, we want to detect with an overwhelming probability. Here, a constant probability is sufficient. And the hope was that because we kind of have a weaker security requirement, one could maybe produce faster protocols than the actively secure protocols that we have. In 2012, Asharaf and Orlandi kind of argued that this notion of covert security may not be really sufficient for real world use, because if the honest parties detect that somebody cheated or attempted to cheat, then they cannot actually convince any third party of this event having happened. So what they introduce is this extended model, which they call covert adversaries, like covert security with public verifiability, where they additionally require that the honest parties, upon detecting some misbehavior, can produce a certificate which they can show to a third party, such that the third party is convinced of like this event having happened. And naturally, kind of now we assume that every party is associated with some public signature key, which kind of is the identity of this party. Okay. So what do we know so far about covert security and public verifiability? So we do know how to actually do quite efficient garbled circuits and multi-party extension of garbled circuits, BMR, with covert security without public verifiability. We have efficient protocols for that. We have a compiler which takes as input a protocol which is secure in the honest majority setting and is of a certain secret sharing form. And the compiler outputs, again, a protocol without public verifiability with covert security, which is also secure in the same corruption model. We have a protocol for pre-processing for speeds. So just roughly, speeds is basically a protocol which we can, like the overall protocol, we can split it in a pre-processing phase and an online phase. And the pre-processing phase is the expensive part of this protocol. So this is the slowest part of the protocol. And in this work, they show how we can kind of do a faster pre-processing where we only require covert security, and then plugging it in together with a standard online phase, we get an overall faster protocol. And since last year, kind of as a result of a line of works, we know how to do efficient garbled circuits with public verifiability. So only the last work actually achieves covert security with public verifiability. And now if we kind of look at the state of the art, then we notice three things. So first of all, 3 of those results are specific protocols. So to achieve their goal, they look at very specific properties of the protocols they use, and then they exploit them to kind of lift the security from the passively secure protocol they look at to covert security or covert security with public verifiability. And one of these approaches is a compiler, so it works kind of for any input passively secure protocol, but unfortunately it only works in the honest majority setting. So in particular, it doesn't apply to the two-party setting. Okay, so I want to make like a very short detour why compilers are cool. So like one could argue that we have garbled circuits and speeds, and these are great and very efficient protocols. But maybe tomorrow, in a hypothetical world where Alice can go to the office, she comes up with a new protocol for evaluating neural networks. So it will be like a custom-built, passively secure protocol, which solves this problem much faster than any generic approach with garbled circuits or speeds. So in this case, maybe the techniques that we know to lift this protocol to active security or covert security, they may not be applicable. So we have to come up with a new approach of how to do this. So one of the good approaches that we can do is we can like develop compilers, because I just plug in this protocol into the compiler and I automatically get a stronger security notion for a new protocol that just appeared. So compilers are an interesting research topic for this kind of perspective. Okay, so in this work, we basically present several compilers, and all of our results produce protocols which provide covert security against covert adversaries with public verifiability. So in a little bit more detail what we achieve. So first we start and we present a compiler for the two-party preprocessing case. So we first consider protocols which do not have any private inputs, but they produce some output. So at first it may seem that this is not a super useful protocol because it doesn't have any inputs, but this is a very common thing to do where we want to set up some correlated randomness. So for example, something that we do in speeds where this preprocessing phase sets some correlated randomness that we then later on use in the online phase. So using our first compiler, we actually obtain the most efficient two-party speeds version with covert security and public verifiability. And then again, based on the first compiler, we also show how to compile arbitrary two-party protocols now with private inputs into protocols that have covert security with public verifiability. And lastly, something that I'm not going to talk about here, but just mention, in the paper, we show how to extend this to multi-party protocols, but I should mention that like this kind of gives you the desired efficiency, probably only for small numbers of parties. So there's still open work to do there. Okay, so how does our compiler for protocols with no inputs work? So we have two parties, Alice and Bob, and they have access to some passively secure protocol. So what does this mean? They can exchange some messages, they send messages back and forth, and at the end of this computation, Bob will output B1, which is his output, and Alice will output A1, which is her output. And because this protocol is passively secure, if Alice decides to send a malicious message, we have no security guarantees, so Bob's output may be not well formed or just like an incorrect output. Yeah. So the first idea that comes to mind is, okay, we'll just run the protocol several times. And because we want public verifiability, so we want to prove that we received some bad message from Alice, we will let both parties sign each of the messages they send to each other. So we will run this protocol several times in parallel. And what we will then do at the end of the protocol execution, we will select two of those executions at random, and we will open all of the randomness that we used in these executions to see whether both parties behaved in accordance to the protocol descriptions and the random tapes that they open. So I should mention here that because we have no inputs, the random tape and the protocol description uniquely determines which messages should be sent. And then after they check that these two executions are fine, they can use the outputs of the last execution. And we kind of crucially exploit the point here that because there are no private inputs, we can just open everything to check whether the executions are correct. Okay, so now we run into a problem because we want public verifiability. So once we say, hey, this is the executions that we would like to open, if Alice doesn't like the executions that we want to check, she can just abort and stop responding. And in this case, Bob does not actually have any evidence of this malicious behavior because he cannot produce any kind of certificate that he can show to a third party. So an approach to get around this problem is that before we run the protocol, Bob will, via oblivious transfer, obtain the secret, the random coins that Alice is going to use in these 3 executions. So for example, here Bob obtains these coins for the first execution. Alice does the same for the 3rd execution. So now both parties can check whether the messages they receive are correct, but neither Alice nor Bob know which executions are being checked, so they cannot make their decision to abort depend on this knowledge. Okay, so now they know this. They run the protocol. At the end of the protocol, they open these executions, and then they use the last execution, which is not checked by either of them. So here we kind of also exploit the fact that now, if we have k executions, each of the parties checks less than k half of the executions. So we are guaranteed to have 1 execution that is not checked by either of the parties, from which we can then use the output as the result of the computation. Yeah, use this. Okay, and now if Alice sends a bad message, she can only guess which execution is being checked. So she basically has a probability, in this case, of 1/3 of, of 2/3 of guessing which execution is not checked. So she is being caught with a constant probability. Okay, and because we sign all the messages, somewhat simplified speaking, now Bob also has a signature on this bad message that he can publish to produce a certificate of this misbehavior. Okay, so the compiler for arbitrary protocols works as follows. So now we kind of, so from a high level speaking, the thing that made the first compiler so easy is that we didn't have any private inputs. So we could simply open random things and check, and Bob could look at something without Alice knowing what it is, and there was never an issue with private inputs. So this strategy doesn't directly extend if you have private inputs, which should remain hidden even if you want to check some of the execution. So this is kind of like the main obstacle on a very high level. So what we will now do is imagine we have Alice and Bob with inputs X and Y, and we will use player virtualizations like similar to the IPS compiler or other works that do the same thing. And so now Bob will imagine 3 virtual Bobs and Alice will imagine 3 virtual Alices. And rather than Bob and Alice directly executing a protocol, they will first secret share their inputs. They will secret share them among their virtual parties. And then they let the virtual parties execute some passively secure protocol on their behalf. Okay. And where basically whenever a virtual party of Bob is supposed to send a message, then Bob does that. Whenever a virtual party of Alice is supposed to send a message, Alice does that. So at the end of this, kind of if we use like a regular 6-party protocol here, then they do obtain the output. So we're happy about that. But since again, it is a passively secure protocol that we assume, if one of the virtual parties sends a message to another virtual party, then the output may actually be incorrect. And here it's important to note that if either Alice or Bob want to cheat, the only way they can cheat is to cheat in one of the virtual parties. So if they want to cheat, they have to misbehave in one of the virtual parties. Okay, so what we will now do is we will do kind of the same thing as before. So we will use oblivious transfer so that Alice can check 1 random virtual party of Bob and Bob can check 1 random virtual party of Alice. And now they will run this protocol based on uniformly random tapes for each party, which fall from the sky for the moment. And if a virtual party of Alice sends a message to a virtual party of Bob, then we're fine. We just send this message to Bob. However, now we kind of have a small issue because what does Bob need to check the behavior of this virtual party? So he needs the input of this virtual party, which is the share of the regional input. He needs the random tape, but he also needs to see all of the messages that those parties receive. So now we kind of run into a problem if parties of Alice send messages between each other, because we cannot send this message directly to Bob, because we, like a standard passively secure protocol, usually assumes that those parties are connected by private channels. So what we will instead do is we will kind of also, again, these things fall from the sky. We have symmetric keys for all the communication channels between the parties of Alice and all the communication channels between the parties of Bob. And now if this party Y1 here wants to send a message to the party Y3, so Bob, in addition to his own symmetric keys, will also obtain all of the communication channel keys that belong to the party that he is checking. So now if this party wants to send a message, the top virtual party wants to send a message to the bottom virtual party, then we will send a message. We will send this message also to Bob, but encrypted under this key for this communication channel. And if Bob checks the party, then he is able to decrypt the message and check. However, if this message is a message between two unchecked parties, then he gets an encryption for which he doesn't have the corresponding secret key. So he cannot decrypt the message and cannot see the communication between those two parties. Yes, so this is kind of a very high level overview, and there are many details swept under the rug. So these high level ideas are pretty simple, but actually in practice, it turns out that making them work in a compiler is somewhat subtle and tricky. So I just want to point out a few things that are swept under the rug. So which function do the virtual parties actually compute? So intuitively, one might think is that we have these 6 parties. What they will do is they will reconstruct the secret sharings inside of MPC, and then they will just compute the function that they would like to compute. So it turns out that if you were to do this directly, then this is actually not a secure covertly, not a protocol that provides you with covert security. So in this explanation, I was saying that there is these symmetric keys and the random tapes of the parties, and this all falls magically from the sky. So here we will actually exploit that we have this first compiler, which can generate all of those things for us. So this is what we will use here in our main compiler. And then the last kind of obstacle is to make everything publicly verifiable. So again, kind of, I will refer you to the paper that will hopefully appear soon on ePrint. But making sure that that the protocol is publicly verifiable is somewhat non-trivial, in particular because our compiler wants to do this without using zero knowledge proofs. So one needs to find a correct trade-off between opening enough information about an execution such that one can check that misbehavior indeed occurred, however, not opening too much information such that the private inputs of any of the parties is actually leaked in this certificate. Yes. Cool. So thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, you can ask me.
Thank you very much for the talk, Mark. So we don't have anything in the Q&A right now. Please type it if you have something. Otherwise, do any of the panelists have a question? No? Okay. So thanks again, Mark. Oh, here they're coming through. Okay, first question from Benjamin Schlosser. What is the deterrence factor of these covertly secure protocols, and can it be set arbitrarily high?
So for the pre-processing phase, you can set the deterrence factor. Okay, so first of all, in general, the efficiency of the protocol depends on the deterrence factor. So if I try to set the deterrence factor such that I achieve an actively secure protocol, then the protocol will probably run in exponential time. So this doesn't work. But for any reasonable constant, you can set it as high as you want, with the one note that in the pre-processing, the way I explained it is that I said both parties just check less than half of the executions. You can set it, so this guarantees you that there is an execution that is not checked from which I can use this pre-processed information. I can set it to more than 1/2, but then I maybe need to rerun the protocol just by a probabilistic argument. I can show that with a good probability, if we independently check some random executions, there will still be an execution which is not checked by either of us. So this is kind of an efficiency loss if you have there a factor of deterrence factor of bigger than 1/2. But in the main protocol, you can set it to whatever you like.
So I guess that's related to the last question we have here by Samuel, which is what is the concrete overhead of this protocol? Can you expand a little bit there?
Yes, let me remember. So so in the pre-processing phase, what you do is you run these k executions, and let's say your deterrence factor is roughly k/2. So the overhead in the pre-processing that you get is by the passively secure protocol times k. The rest that you do for achieving public verifiability or covert security is not relevant. You send some signatures, you do an OT. So this kind of disappears for sufficiently large computations. For the main compiler, again, basically, so you split this into these parties, and then these parties run an n-party protocol. So the main bandwidth, the main overhead that you will get is from running this protocol, which is now like, even though you want to have a two-party protocol at the end, you're running an MPC protocol where the number of parties in the protocol depends on the deterrence factor that you would like. So the main overhead of this compiler is the complexity of this multi-party protocol. And again, like all the signatures, this OT stuff is like negligible. Like you can ignore this if you talk about the complexity of the protocol.
Okay. And the other question from Sam is, what kind of protocols does it work with? So are there any restrictions, I guess?
So it has to be passively secure and it has to be a two-party protocol. And that's it. Like there are no extra restrictions.
And finally, a question from Dragos. Why does this only improve over the two-party auditable speeds? Is it because of the number of parties used for the MPC in the head or virtual parties?
So if you try to extend this compiler to more parties, then you would imagine that all the real parties, they will all split themselves into some virtual parties. So now if every virtual party checks some other virtual parties, like, because the more parties you have, the more arrows you have who is checking who. And at some point you just run out of virtual parties, you cannot do too many checks. So if you have more parties, you can do less checks. And this means your deterrence factor goes down and your efficiency goes down. So like, as I say, like for like 3, 4, 5, I don't know, some small number of parties, you can extend it quite nicely, but for larger number of parties, this is not feasible. And especially because any actively secure protocol is also covertly secure with public verifiability. So kind of this compiler is only interesting in a parameter regime where it's faster than the most efficient actively secure compiler.
But is it even a feasibility thing? Like it only works with a constant number of parties, or it's just the concrete overhead is too large?
Just the deterrence factor. So if you have a constant, so like I need to remember what it is, but like if you have n parties and you have a constant fraction of corruptions, then like the bigger this constant gets, the smaller the deterrence factor gets. Like again, like some function of this constant of corruptions. So basically, you cannot set it to an arbitrary value that you would like.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. I have one remark about speeds, just to avoid confusion, perhaps, that if you want to improve speeds with this stuff here, you actually should not compile the actually secure speeds just like that. This help you. What you should do is you should take a passively secure version of the speeds pre-processing, which outputs quality randomness for actively secure speeds. Then you compile this thing. That's very simple because it only requires, the simpler version of the compiler, and after this you run actively secure speeds, hoping that the covert, the secure pre-processing actually caught any misbehavior. And this actually does give you something which is a little bit better than what was known before.
Yeah. Thank you for pointing this out. So like if you compile basically a covertly secure pre-processing with an actively secure online phase, you get an overall protocol which is covertly secure with public verifiability.
Yeah. So there's one last question from Dragos, which is, can you build a n times n party computation? I'm not sure if I'm reading that right. Can the input of a previous calculation be used in the next one? That sounds like you're asking about reactive computation.
So that's a little bit of an abstract question, but like intuitively, I would say that probably yes, because the compiler basically works by initially setting up some watch lists, like an IPS, like I check some random parties of the other party. We all agree on some random tapes. So once we have this, you run your secure computation, which is one or many of them. It doesn't really matter.